baby found a bear cub stuck between moving train cars. What he did next was miraculous. The morning mist hung low over the railway tracks, creating a dreamlike veil that transformed the ordinary steel rails into something almost magical. Jacob Bennet had been walking the same path for years, following the tracks that cut through the dense forest on the outskirts of town. He liked these early morning walks when the world was still quiet, when the only sounds were his footsteps on the gravel and the distant calls of birds awakening to greet the day. But this particular morning was different. There was something in the air, a feeling he couldn't quite place, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The tracks stretched endlessly before him, disappearing into the fog, and he found himself walking slower than usual, his senses somehow more alert to everything around him. That's when he heard it. At first, Jacob thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. The sound was so soft, so unlikely, that he almost dismissed it entirely. But there it was again, a small cry that didn't belong to any bird he knew, didn't match the usual symphony of the forest morning. It was coming from somewhere ahead, where the fog was thickest, where visibility dropped to mere feet. He stopped walking and listened carefully, his head tilted slightly to catch the sound better. The cry came again, and this time he was certain it was real. It sounded young, vulnerable, and somehow lost. Oh, Jacob's heart began to beat a little faster, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of curiosity and concern. He had lived near these tracks all his life, and he knew every sound they made, every rhythm they followed. This was something new, something that didn't belong. As he moved forward through the mist, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was definitely an animal, but not one he could immediately identify. The fog began to lift slightly, and that's when he saw it. A freight train was moving slowly along the tracks, its massive form emerging from the mist like some ancient creature. The train was moving at barely more than walking pace, probably due to the poor visibility, and Jacob found himself walking alongside it without really thinking about what he was doing. The crying sound was coming from the train itself, which made no sense at all. Trains didn't cry. They rumbled and clanked and whistled, but they didn't make soft, plaintive sounds like the one he was hearing now. Jacob picked up his pace slightly, moving along the length of the train, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The train cars passed by him slowly, each one identical to the last, their weathered sides telling stories of countless journeys across the country. And then he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Between two of the cars, in that dangerous gap where the coupling connected them, there was movement. At first, he thought it might be debris caught in the mechanism, but as he looked closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a bear cub, impossibly small and frightened, somehow wedged into the space between the cars. The little creature wasn't hurt, at least not that Jacob could see, but it was definitely stuck. Its dark eyes were wide with fear, and it was making those soft crying sounds that had drawn Jacob's attention in the first place. The sight was so unexpected, so surreal, that for a moment Jacob just stood there, trying to process what he was seeing. How had a bear cub ended up there? The train must have been stationary at some point, perhaps during the night, and the curious cub had climbed aboard to explore. Now, with the train moving, even at this slow pace, the cub was trapped, being carried away from wherever it had come from. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities. Should he try to signal the engineer? Should he call for help? But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, he knew there wasn't time for conventional solutions. The train, though moving slowly, was still moving, and every second took the cub farther from its home. That's when Jacob noticed something else. something that made his heart skip a beat. At the edge of the forest, barely visible through the remaining wisps of fog, stood another bear. This one was much larger, clearly an adult, and Jacob knew immediately that this was the cub's mother. She wasn't charging or showing any signs of aggression. Instead, she was just standing there, watching the train carry her baby away. The look in her eyes was something Jacob would never forget. It wasn't the fierce, protective rage he might have expected from a mother bear. It was something far more human, far more heartbreaking. It was helplessness, pure and simple. She knew her cub was in trouble, but she also seemed to understand that she couldn't simply attack the massive metal beast that had taken her child. The mother bear began to move, not toward Jacob or the train, but parallel to the tracks, keeping pace with the slow-moving cars. She moved through the trees with a grace that belied her size, never taking her eyes off the spot where her cub was trapped. Jacob found himself caught between two instincts. Part of him wanted to back away, to put distance between himself and a mother bear, who might at any moment decide he was a threat. But another part, a stronger part, couldn't bear to walk away from this scene. The cub's cries had grown more frequent now, as if it had sensed its mother's presence and was calling out to her. The sound was heartbreaking in its desperation, and Jacob felt something shift inside him. A determination he hadn't expected. He began to walk alongside the train again, matching its pace, keeping himself visible to both the cub and its mother. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he had to do something. The train was long, probably 60 or 70 cars, and it would take time for it all to pass. Maybe when it did, there would be an opportunity to help. Or maybe the train would stop at the junction a few miles ahead, where the tracks split. Jacob had no real plan, just a feeling that he needed to stay with this situation, to see it through somehow. As he walked, he began to talk softly, not to anyone in particular, but just to fill the silence with something other than the cub's cries. He talked about the morning, about the mist, about anything that came to mind. His voice seemed to have a calming effect on the cub, which stopped crying quite so frantically and instead watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. The mother bear continued her parallel journey through the forest, occasionally disappearing behind thicker stands of trees, only to reappear moments later, always maintaining her vigil. Jacob found himself oddly moved by her dedication, by the way she refused to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. He had always thought of bears as simple creatures, driven by instinct and appetite, but what he was witnessing now was something far more complex. This was love, pure and simple, a mother's love for her child that transcended species boundaries. It was universal, recognizable, and deeply touching. The train continued its slow journey, and Jacob continued his walk alongside it, creating a strange procession through the morning mist. A man, a machine, and two bears, all moving together toward an uncertain destination. As they moved, Jacob noticed details he might otherwise have missed. The way the morning light was beginning to break through the fog, creating shafts of golden illumination that made the whole scene look like something from a dream. The way the cub had positioned itself in the gap, not randomly but carefully, as if it had tried to make itself as comfortable as possible in its predicament. The way the mother bear's breath created small puffs of vapor in the cool morning air as she maintained her steady pace through the forest. These details seemed important somehow, worth noticing and remembering. They transformed what could have been a simple wildlife encounter into something more profound, more meaningful. Jacob thought about all the mornings he had walked these tracks, all the times he had passed by without really seeing, without really being present. How many small dramas had played out here without his knowledge? How many stories had unfolded in this margin between civilization and wilderness? The railway tracks had always seemed like such a human thing, a mark of progress and industry carved through the natural world. But now he saw them differently. They were also a part of the ecosystem, a feature that the wildlife had learned to navigate, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The cub's predicament was proof of that delicate balance, that intersection between two worlds that didn't always mesh perfectly. Speaking of connections and the unexpected ways our paths cross with nature, if you've ever had your own encounter with wildlife, whether it was a moment of wonder or a chance to help, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. These stories remind us that we share this world with so many incredible creatures, and sometimes, just sometimes, we get the chance to make a difference in their lives. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories that remind us of the magic that still exists in our world, often in the most unexpected places. Your support helps me share these moments of connection between humans and nature. And who knows, maybe your story will inspire someone else to pay attention, to care, to act when the moment calls for it. The train began to slow even more, and Jacob felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was approaching a signal, or maybe there was another train ahead. Whatever the reason, this could be the opportunity he had been waiting for. He looked over at the mother bear, wondering if she sensed the change too. She had stopped moving and was standing very still, her head raised slightly as if she was listening to something Jacob couldn't hear. The cub must have sensed something too, because it began to shift in its confined space, trying to position itself differently. Jacob moved closer to the train, close enough now that he could see the cub clearly. It was so young, probably only a few months old, with fur that still had that fluffy baby quality to it. Its paws seemed too big for its body, a sign that it still had a lot of growing to do, if it ever got the chance to grow. The train came to a complete stop with a long, drawn-out squeal of brakes that echoed through the forest. Jacob's heart was pounding now. This was it, the moment when something had to happen. But what? He couldn't just reach in and grab the cub. Even a baby bear had claws and teeth, and more importantly, its mother was watching from less than 50 feet away. Any sudden movement, any sign of aggression toward her cub, and she might charge. Jacob had to think carefully, had to find a way to help without making things worse. He looked around, searching for inspiration, for some tool or technique that might work. That's when he noticed a long branch that had fallen near the tracks, sturdy enough to be useful but not so large as to be unwieldy. Moving slowly, telegraphing his intentions as clearly as possible, Jacob picked up the branch. He held it out toward the mother bear for a moment, showing her what he had, trying somehow to communicate that he meant no harm. Whether she understood or not, she didn't react aggressively. She just watched, her eyes never leaving her cub. Jacob approached the gap where the cub was stuck, moving with deliberate slowness. He could see now how the cub had gotten trapped. It had climbed up when the cars were stationary, probably during a stop in the night, and had wedged itself into the coupling area. Now, with the mechanism under tension from the train's movement, even though it was stopped, the space had narrowed just enough to prevent the cub from backing out the way it had come in. Using the branch, Jacob began to gently prod at the coupling mechanism, not trying to force anything but just testing to see if there was any give, any way to create a little more space. The cub watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, occasionally letting out small whimpers that tore at Jacob's heart. He talked to it softly as he worked. Nonsense, really, just soothing sounds meant to keep it calm. He told it about its mother, how she was waiting, how everything would be okay. He didn't know if any of this was true, but it felt important to say it, to put that hope out into the universe. The branch wasn't working the way he had hoped. The coupling was too solid, too heavy for him to move. He needed a different approach. That's when he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. Jacob turned to see a man approaching, wearing the uniform of a railway worker. The man was older, probably in his 60s, with weathered hands and kind eyes. His name tag read Michael Hayes, and he didn't seem surprised to see Jacob there, or even to see the trapped cub. In fact, he seemed to have been expecting something like this. Michael nodded to Jacob, then looked over at the mother bear, who was still maintaining her vigil at the forest's edge. Without saying a word, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a sandwich wrapped in paper. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing thick slices of bread with peanut butter, and Jacob suddenly understood. This wasn't the first time Michael had encountered this cub. Michael spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly but gentle. He explained that he had been seeing this cub around the railway yard for the past week. It had been orphaned, he thought at first, hanging around the stationary trains at night, looking for food. Michael had started leaving things for it. Nothing much, just scraps from his lunch, trying to keep it alive while he figured out what to do. He had called wildlife services, but they were overwhelmed and understaffed, said they would come when they could. Michael had never seen the mother bear before, had assumed the cub was alone in the world. But now, seeing her there at the forest's edge, he realized he had been wrong. The cub hadn't been orphaned at all. It had just been exploring, being a curious young bear, and had gotten separated from its mother in the maze of the rail yard. The two men stood there for a moment processing this information, understanding now that they were dealing with a reunion, not a rescue. The cub needed to get back to its mother, yes, but more than that, these two bears needed to find each other again after what must have been a terrifying separation. Michael had an idea. He had keys to some of the maintenance equipment, including the manual coupling release. It was an old safety feature, rarely used anymore, but it might work. He asked Jacob to keep watch to make sure the mother bear didn't decide to intervene while he worked. Jacob positioned himself where he could see both the mother and the cub, ready to, well, he wasn't sure what he would do if the mother charged, but he would figure that out if it happened. Michael worked with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and confident despite his age. He located the manual release mechanism, hidden under a protective cover that was rusted with age and disuse. It took some effort to get it open, and even more effort to turn the release wheel, but gradually, incrementally, the coupling began to loosen. The cub, sensing the change, began to struggle more actively, trying to pull itself free. Jacob found himself holding his breath, afraid that the cub might injure itself in its desperation to escape. But Michael knew what he was doing. He worked the mechanism carefully, creating just enough space for the cub to squeeze through without the whole coupling coming apart. And then, suddenly, the cub was free. It tumbled onto the gravel beside the tracks, a little ball of fur and confusion. For a moment it just sat there, as if it couldn't quite believe it was no longer trapped. Then it looked up at Jacob and Michael, and Jacob could swear he saw gratitude in those dark eyes. But the moment was brief. The cub's head snapped toward the forest, toward where its mother was waiting, and without hesitation it began to run. Not the clumsy, tumbling run Jacob might have expected from such a young animal, but a purposeful, directed sprint toward the one thing in the world that mattered most to it. The mother bear had started moving too, coming out from the tree line, no longer concerned about the humans or the train. Her focus was entirely on her cub, and when they met, about halfway between the tracks and the forest, it was a collision of fur and emotion that made Jacob's eyes water. The mother sniffed her cub all over, checking for injuries, reassuring herself that it was really there, really safe. The cub pressed against her, making small sounds that were nothing like the desperate cries from earlier. These were sounds of comfort, of coming home. The two bears stayed like that for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute or two, just being together, re-establishing their bond. Then, without any acknowledgement of the humans who had helped make this reunion possible, they turned and walked back into the forest. The mother bear led the way, the cub following close behind, occasionally bumping into her legs as if to reassure itself that she was still there. They disappeared into the trees as quietly as they had appeared, leaving Jacob and Michael standing by the tracks in the growing morning light. The train would start moving again soon, continuing its journey to wherever it was going. But for Jacob, for Michael, and for two bears in the forest, this moment would linger far longer than the train's presence. Michael broke the silence first, chuckling softly and shaking his head. He talked about how he had been working these rails for 40 years, had seen all manner of strange things, but this was a first. A bear cub hitchhiking on a freight train, and its mother following along like she was waiting at a bus stop. It was the kind of story people wouldn't believe if you told them, the kind that sounded made up even when you knew it was true. But that was the thing about life, Michael said. The most incredible stories were often the ones that really happened, the ones that reminded you that the world was still full of surprises, still capable of producing moments of pure magic. Jacob agreed, but he was thinking about something else too. He was thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If he hadn't decided to walk the tracks this morning, if the fog hadn't muffled sounds in just the right way for him to hear the cub's cries, if Michael hadn't been working this particular shift, if the train hadn't stopped when it did. So many ifs, so many moments where things could have gone differently, but they hadn't. Everything had aligned perfectly to create this opportunity for reunion, for redemption, for a second chance. It made him wonder how many other moments like this were happening all around the world, all the time, unwitnessed and uncelebrated, but no less miraculous for their anonymity. Michael had to go. The train needed to get moving again, and he had work to do. But before he left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another sandwich. This one, apparently, his actual lunch. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it toward the edge of the forest, toward where the bears had disappeared. Just in case they were still hungry, he said with a grin. Then he climbed back aboard the train, and within minutes the massive machine was moving again, continuing its journey as if nothing had happened. Jacob watched it go, each car passing by with a rhythmic clacking that was almost hypnotic. When the last car finally passed and the sound of the train faded into the distance, the morning seemed impossibly quiet. Jacob stood there for a while longer, not quite ready to leave this place where something extraordinary had happened. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the morning mist, revealing the forest in all its green glory. Birds were singing, insects were buzzing, and life was continuing as it always did. But for Jacob, something had changed. He had been part of something special, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness. He had been a witness to love, to determination, to the incredible bonds that exist between mothers and their children, regardless of species. As he finally turned to walk back home, Jacob found himself thinking about all the people who would take this same walk today, who would pass by this exact spot without knowing what had happened here. They would see only tracks and forest, the mundane intersection of two worlds. They wouldn't know about the cub's cries, the mother's vigil, Michael's sandwiches, or the moment when everything came together to create a small miracle. And that was okay. Not every miracle needed to be witnessed by crowds. Sometimes the most powerful moments were the quiet ones, the ones shared by just a few souls who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But Jacob also thought about the stories we miss, the dramas that unfold just outside our perception. How many mother bears had watched their cubs disappear into the unknown? How many Michael Hayes were out there, quietly doing good without expecting recognition? How many opportunities for connection, for compassion, for making a difference, passed by unnoticed every single day? It was both humbling and inspiring to think about. It made him want to pay more attention, to be more present, to look for those moments when he could be part of something bigger than himself. The walk home felt different than the walk out had been. The same path, the same trees, the same morning air, but Jacob was seeing it all through new eyes. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The way certain trees leaned toward the tracks, as if drawn to the human world. The small paths through the underbrush that indicated regular animal traffic. The scattered remnants of human presence, a dropped glove here, a candy wrapper there, each one telling a small story of someone who had passed this way. The world was full of stories, he realized, full of connections and coincidences and moments of grace. You just had to be paying attention to see them. When Jacob got home, his wife Jessica was in the kitchen making breakfast. She asked him about his walk, the same question she asked every morning, usually receiving the same answer that it was fine, nothing special. But today, Jacob had a story to tell. As he recounted the morning's events, he watched Jessica's expression change from polite interest to genuine amazement. She asked questions, wanted details, made him tell certain parts twice. And when he was done, she sat quietly for a moment, processing what she had heard. Then she said something that would stay with Jacob for a long time. She said that maybe this was why he walked those tracks every morning. Not just for exercise or fresh air, but because he was meant to be there today, at this exact time, for this exact purpose. It was a comforting thought, the idea that there might be some design to the seemingly random events of life, that maybe we all had appointments with destiny that we didn't know about until we were in the middle of them. Jacob didn't know if he believed in fate or providence or any of that, but he did believe in being present, in being ready when life presented you with an opportunity to make a difference. And that's what had happened today. He had been present, he had been ready, and he had played his small part in a story that was bigger than himself. Over the next few days, Jacob found himself returning to the tracks at the same early hour, partly out of habit, but mostly out of hope that he might see the bears again. He never did, at least not directly, but he did find signs of their presence. Tracks in the soft earth beside the rails, claw marks on a tree where the cub had probably been practicing its climbing, a patch of flattened grass where they might have rested. These signs were enough to tell him that they were still out there, still together, still living their lives in the forest that bordered the human world. And that knowledge filled him with a quiet joy, a sense that all was right with the world, at least in this small corner of it. Michael, he learned later, had filed a report about the incident, not to get anyone in trouble, but to suggest that maybe the railway company should look into better ways to prevent wildlife from getting trapped in their equipment. It was a small thing, probably wouldn't go anywhere, but it was something. A recognition that these encounters were likely to happen again. And maybe, just maybe, they could be prevented, or at least handled better. Jacob liked that Michael had taken that step. It showed that the morning's events had affected him too, had made him think about the relationship between the railway and the wilderness it passed through. The story spread, as stories do in small communities. Jacob would hear versions of it in the coffee shop, at the grocery store, each telling slightly different, usually more dramatic than what had actually happened. In some versions, Jacob had wrestled the cub free with his bare hands. In others, the mother bear had charged, and Jacob had stood his ground, protecting both the cub and Michael. Jacob never corrected these embellishments. He understood that people needed their stories to be bigger, more dramatic, more clearly heroic. The truth that it had been a quiet, careful collaboration between two men and a trusting mother bear was somehow both more and less than what people wanted to hear. But for Jacob, the truth was enough. More than enough. It was a reminder that heroism didn't always look like the movies, that sometimes it was just showing up, paying attention, and doing what needed to be done. It was Michael with his sandwiches and his railway keys. It was the mother bear trusting two humans near her cub. It was the cub itself, brave enough to cry for help instead of suffering in silence. Everyone in the story had played their part, had contributed to the outcome. There was no single hero, no dramatic moment of triumph. Just a series of small, careful actions that added up to something wonderful. As the weeks passed, the story began to fade from the community's collective memory, replaced by newer gossip, fresher drama. But Jacob continued his morning walks, continued to pay attention to the world around him. He never saw the bears again, but he saw other things. A fox teaching her kits to hunt. An owl that had taken up residence in an old railway signal box. A family of rabbits that had learned the train schedule and knew exactly when it was safe to cross the tracks. Each sighting was a small gift, a reminder of the parallel world that existed alongside the human one, the world that was always there if you just knew how to look for it. One morning, about a month after the incident with the cub, Jacob found something on the tracks. It was a tuft of dark fur, caught on a splinter of wood on one of the railway ties. It could have been from any animal, could have been there for days or weeks, but Jacob knew somehow that it was from the cub. Maybe it had been exploring again, hopefully more carefully this time. Or maybe it had just been passing through, following its mother on some bear business that humans could only guess at. Jacob picked up the tuft of fur, held it up to the morning light. It was soft, still carrying that baby fineness that would eventually be replaced by coarser adult fur. He put it in his pocket, a small token of a morning that had changed him in ways he was still discovering. That evening, Jacob showed the fur to Jessica. She held it carefully, as if it was precious, which in a way it was. She suggested they frame it, put it somewhere they could see it and remember. But Jacob had a different idea. The next morning, he took the tuft of fur back to the tracks, to the exact spot where the cub had been trapped. He placed it at the base of a tree at the forest's edge, returning it to the world it belonged to. It felt like the right thing to do, a closing of the circle that had begun that misty morning. As he walked away, Jacob felt a sense of completion, of a story properly ended. But of course, stories never really end. They just transform into other stories, influence other lives, create ripples that spread out in ways we can never fully track. Somewhere in the forest, a bear cub was growing stronger, learning the lessons its mother was teaching it about survival and safety. Somewhere on the railway, Michael was probably still leaving out sandwiches just in case. And somewhere in between, in that margin where the human world and the wild world met, new stories were beginning, new connections were being made, new miracles were waiting to unfold. The train still passed through every morning, its rhythm as constant as a heartbeat. The forest still stood, ancient and patient, full of secrets and surprises, and Jacob still walked the tracks, a witness to the ongoing dance between civilization and nature, ready for whatever story might reveal itself next. Because that was the real miracle he had come to understand. Not just the dramatic moments of rescue and reunion, but the ongoing, everyday miracle of coexistence. The fact that we share this world with so many other lives, other stories, other forms of consciousness that we barely understand. The fact that sometimes, if we're paying attention, if we're present and ready, we get to be part of something bigger than ourselves. 2 chapters of Mentioned Part has completed. The second morning, after finding the tuft of fur, Jacob noticed something different about his usual walk. The air carried a charge, an electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. It was clear and cool, perfect walking conditions, but there was something else, something that made him slow his pace and pay even closer attention than usual. The tracks stretched ahead as they always did, but today they seemed to be leading somewhere specific, somewhere important. Jacob couldn't explain the feeling, but he had learned to trust these instincts, these subtle messages from a part of himself that knew things his conscious mind didn't. As he walked, he thought about Michael, whom he hadn't seen since that morning with the cub. The railway workers operated on schedules that were mysterious to outsiders, appearing and disappearing according to needs that Jacob could only guess at. But he found himself hoping to encounter the older man again, to share a knowing look, to acknowledge their shared experience. There was a brotherhood in what they had done, a connection forged by circumstance and compassion. It was the kind of bond that didn't need words or frequent contact to remain strong. It simply existed, a thread connecting 2 lives that might otherwise never have intersected. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Jacob of Jessica's watercolor paintings. She had taken up art recently, inspired, she said, by Jacob's story about the bears. She wanted to capture moments of beauty, of connection, of the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. Her paintings were abstract, impressionistic, but Jacob could see the influence of that morning in every brushstroke. The way she used color to suggest emotion rather than depict reality. The way her compositions always seemed to be about relationships, about things coming together or pulling apart. Art, like life, was about paying attention, about seeing what was really there rather than what you expected to see. A sound pulled Jacob from his thoughts. It was mechanical, rhythmic, but not from a train. As he rounded a bend in the tracks, he saw the source. A small maintenance vehicle was parked on the rails, and beside it stood Michael, along with a younger woman Jacob didn't recognize. They were examining something on the ground, their postures suggesting concern. Jacob approached carefully, not wanting to interrupt but curious about what had drawn their attention. Michael looked up as he got closer, and his weathered face broke into a smile of recognition. He waved Jacob over, and as Jacob got closer, he could see what they were looking at. It was a fox lying still beside the tracks. For a moment, Jacob's heart sank, thinking it was dead, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of its chest, the occasional twitch of an ear. The fox was alive but clearly in distress. The woman, who Michael introduced as Lily Morgan, a wildlife veterinarian who worked with the railway company on animal-related incidents, was examining the fox carefully. She explained that it appeared to have been clipped by a train, not seriously injured but stunned and possibly concussed. She had been called out early this morning when an engineer reported seeing an animal on the tracks that didn't move away in time. The fox was beautiful, even in its distressed state. Its red fur caught the morning light like flame, and its face had an intelligence that was almost human. Lily worked with practiced efficiency, checking for broken bones, examining its eyes for signs of head trauma. She talked as she worked, explaining that foxes were usually too smart and too quick to get caught by trains, but this one might have been hunting and gotten too focused on its prey to notice the danger. Or it might have been a young fox, still learning the dangers of the human world. Either way, it was lucky. A few inches difference, and it wouldn't have survived. Michael had brought a blanket from his vehicle, and together they carefully wrapped the fox, preparing to transport it to Lily's clinic. But as they lifted it, something unexpected happened. From the brush beside the tracks came a sound, high-pitched and desperate. Another fox, smaller than the injured one, appeared at the edge of the forest. It was making distressed calls, clearly agitated by seeing the other fox being taken away. Lily immediately understood. The injured fox was a vixen, a mother, and this was one of her kits. Probably old enough to be on its own, but still maintaining a connection with its parent. The situation had suddenly become more complicated. They couldn't just take the injured fox and leave the kit, but they also couldn't leave the injured fox here to potentially die. Lily made a quick decision. She asked Michael and Jacob to help her set up a temporary observation post. If the vixen wasn't too badly injured, she might recover on her own with just a little time and protection. They could monitor her from a distance, make sure she was safe from predators and trains, and see if she improved. If not, they would take her to the clinic, but this way, they could keep her close to her kit. Maintain that connection that was clearly so important to both animals. They moved the vixen carefully to a safer spot, a small clearing just off the tracks but still visible from where they would watch. The kit followed at a distance, suspicious of the humans but unwilling to abandon its mother. Lily had emergency supplies in her vehicle, including a small tent that could serve as a blind. Within half an hour, they had established a makeshift observation post, far enough away not to stress the foxes, but close enough to intervene if necessary. Lily said she would stay for a few hours, but she had other calls to make. She asked if either Michael or Jacob could spell her later. Without hesitation, both men volunteered. And so began an unexpected vigil. Jacob went home to tell Jessica what was happening, to grab some supplies and cancel his plans for the day. When he returned, Michael was in the blind, binoculars trained on the foxes. The vixen had moved slightly, a good sign, and the kit had curled up beside her, providing warmth and comfort. They settled into a routine, taking turns watching, making notes about the vixen's condition, ensuring no other animals or trains posed a threat. It was quiet work, meditative in its way, just sitting, watching, being present for creatures that needed nothing from them but time and space to heal. As the hours passed, Jacob and Michael talked quietly, sharing stories about their lives, their experiences with wildlife, their thoughts about the relationship between humans and nature. Michael talked about his 40 years on the railway, how he had seen the land change, development creeping closer, wildlife corridors being cut off. But he had also seen adaptation, animals learning to live with and around human infrastructure. The railway, he said, wasn't just a scar on the landscape. For some animals it had become a pathway, a way to move through increasingly fragmented habitat. It was complicated, this intersection of worlds, neither wholly good nor wholly bad. Jacob shared his own observations from his morning walks, the patterns he had noticed, the small dramas he had witnessed. He talked about how the incident with the bear cub had changed him, made him more aware of his role as a neighbor to these wild creatures. He wasn't their protector or their enemy, just another inhabitant of this borderland between civilization and wilderness. The key was respect, he had come to believe. Respect for their intelligence, their autonomy, their right to exist on their own terms. Help when you could, step back when you should, and always, always pay attention. By midday, the vixen was showing more signs of recovery. She had lifted her head several times, had even attempted to groom herself, though the effort seemed to exhaust her. The kit had ventured out briefly to hunt, returning with the small rodent that it placed near its mother's head. The vixen hadn't eaten it, but the gesture was touching, a role reversal that showed the deep bonds within fox families. Lily returned in the afternoon, pleased with the progress. She examined the vixen from a distance with binoculars, noting improved responsiveness and coordination. She thought another night of rest might be all the fox needed. They decided to maintain the vigil through the night, taking shifts. Jacob took the evening shift, watching as the sun set and the forest came alive with nocturnal activity. Owls called from the trees, small mammals rustled through the underbrush, and the foxes remained quiet in their temporary refuge. The kit stayed close to its mother, occasionally nuzzling her, trying to provoke a response. As darkness fell completely, Jacob used a night vision scope Lily had left, amazed at the hidden world it revealed. Animals he never would have known were there, moved through the darkness with confidence, living their lives parallel to but separate from the human world. Around midnight, something remarkable happened. The vixen suddenly stood up, wobbly at first, but gaining steadiness with each moment. The kit immediately became excited, dancing around its mother, making soft yipping sounds of joy. The vixen took a few tentative steps, then a few more. She was moving slowly, carefully, but she was moving. Jacob watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the two foxes touched noses, a greeting that seemed to communicate relief and recognition. Then, without any acknowledgement of Jacob's presence, they began to move away, the vixen leading, the kit following, disappearing into the forest as if they had never been there at all. Jacob stayed in the blind for another hour, partly to make sure they didn't return, partly because he wasn't ready for the experience to end. This was different from the bear cub rescue, quieter, less dramatic, but no less meaningful. It was about patience, about creating space for healing, about trusting in the resilience of wild things. When Michael arrived to relieve him, Jacob told him what had happened. Michael smiled, unsurprised. He had seen enough to know that wildlife was tougher than most people gave it credit for. They didn't need saving as much as they needed respect, space, and occasionally a little time to recover from their encounters with the human world. The next morning, Jacob returned to his usual walk, but he stopped at the spot where they had maintained their vigil. There was no sign of the foxes except for a few tracks in the soft earth, already being obscured by wind and weather. It was as if the whole thing had never happened, except for the memory of it, the knowledge that for one day and night, 3 humans had put aside their own concerns to help 2 foxes in need. It wasn't heroic, wouldn't make the news, wouldn't even be remembered by most people, but it mattered. It was another thread in the tapestry of connection that linked all living things, another moment of grace in a world that often seemed short on such things. Lily had left a message for Jacob and Michael, thanking them for their help. She said that incidents like this were becoming more common as development pushed wildlife into closer contact with human infrastructure. The railway company was trying to be more proactive, installing wildlife crossings in some areas, adjusting schedules during migration seasons, training engineers to watch for animals. It was slow progress, but it was progress. Every small step toward coexistence was valuable, she said. Every person who cared enough to help made a difference. Jacob liked that perspective. It made his morning walks feel like more than just exercise. They were a form of witness, a way of being present for the ongoing negotiation between the human and natural worlds. A week later, Jacob saw the foxes again, or at least he thought it was them. A flash of red in the morning light, 2 forms moving through the underbrush parallel to the tracks. They were hunting, he realized, working together to corner some small prey. The larger fox, the one he thought was the vixen, moved with no sign of injury, as fluid and graceful as any healthy fox. They disappeared into the forest before he could be certain it was them, but he chose to believe it was. It made the story complete, gave it the ending it deserved. Not a dramatic rescue, but a quiet return to normalcy, to the ancient patterns of predator and prey, parent and child, wilderness and survival. Michael found Jacob on the tracks one morning about a month later. He had news. The railway company had approved funding for a series of wildlife underpasses in the area, small tunnels that would allow animals to cross beneath the tracks safely. It wasn't much, and it would take time to implement, but it was something. A recognition that the railway existed within an ecosystem, not apart from it. Michael thought their recent experiences with the bear cub and the foxes had played a part in the decision. The reports they had filed, the documentation of these encounters had made an impact. Sometimes, Michael said, change happened slowly, one small victory at a time. They stood there together, two men who had become friends through their shared experiences with wildlife in distress. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind that made you glad to be alive and outside. A train approached in the distance, its horn echoing through the valley, a sound that had once seemed like an intrusion, but now felt like part of the landscape's music. They stepped aside to let it pass, watching the cars roll by with their mysterious cargoes heading to destinations unknown. When it was gone, the silence that followed seemed deeper, more meaningful. It was the silence of the forest reasserting itself, of life continuing despite interruptions. Jacob thought about all the mornings he had walked these tracks, all the ones still to come. Each one was an opportunity, a chance to witness something extraordinary disguised as ordinary. The bear cub and the foxes had been dramatic examples, but there were smaller miracles every day. The spider webs jeweled with dew, the hawk that used the telephone poles as hunting perches, the flowers that somehow grew between the railroad ties, finding life in the most unlikely places. These things had always been there, but now he saw them, really saw them. The incidents with the animals had opened his eyes, had taught him how to pay attention in a way he never had before. Jessica had started joining him on some of his walks, bringing her sketch pad to capture quick impressions of the landscape. She said the tracks had become her favorite subject, the way they created a line through the natural world that was both division and connection. Her paintings had evolved, become more confident, more expressive. She was having a small show at the local library next month, calling it Borderlands, exploring the spaces where human and natural worlds met. Several of the pieces were inspired by Jacob's stories, though abstracted into forms and colors that suggested rather than depicted. Art, she said, was another way of paying attention, of honoring the world around us. The community had begun to change too, in small ways. More people were walking the tracks, not just for exercise, but to observe, to be present. Someone had started a wildlife sighting log at the coffee shop, where people could record what they had seen. It was filling up with entries, some mundane, some remarkable, all testament to the rich life that existed at the margins of the town. There was talk of forming a volunteer group to help monitor wildlife along the railway, to be ready when situations like the bear cub or the foxes arose. It might not happen, might fizzle out like so many good intentions, but the fact that people were talking about it, thinking about it, was itself a kind of progress. One morning, Jacob met a young boy named Connor Adams walking with his grandfather along the tracks. The boy was excited, pointing out every bird, every squirrel, asking endless questions about the animals that lived here. His grandfather, patient and knowledgeable, was answering as best he could, but Jacob could see he was struggling with some of the more complex questions. Jacob joined them for a while, sharing what he had learned, telling simplified versions of his encounters with the bears and foxes. Connor's eyes went wide with wonder, and he made his grandfather promise to bring him back every week to look for animals. As they parted ways, Connor's grandfather thanked Jacob, said it was good for the boy to hear these stories, to know that ordinary people could make a difference for wildlife. Too much of what kids saw these days made them feel helpless, he said. Stories like Jacob's showed them that individuals could matter, that paying attention and caring could lead to real action, real results. Jacob hadn't thought of it that way, but he liked the idea that his experiences might inspire others, especially young people, to pay attention to the natural world, to see themselves as part of it rather than separate from it. The seasons were beginning to change, summer giving way to autumn, and with it came new patterns of wildlife activity. Migration season was starting, and the tracks became a highway for birds heading south. Jacob learned to identify different species by their calls, their flight patterns, their behavior. He started carrying a small notebook, jotting down observations, quick sketches, thoughts that occurred to him. He wasn't trying to be scientific about it, just trying to capture the richness of what he was seeing, to honor it with his attention. The notebook filled up quickly, becoming a record not just of wildlife sightings but of his own evolving relationship with this landscape. One particularly misty morning, reminiscent of the day he had found the bear cub, Jacob encountered Lily again. She was checking a series of camera traps she had set up to monitor wildlife use of the railway corridor. She showed him some of the footage on her tablet, and Jacob was amazed at what the cameras had captured. Bears, foxes, deer, coyotes, even a bobcat, all using the tracks as a travel route at various times of day and night. The railway wasn't just something wildlife had to navigate around or over. For many species, it had become part of their territory, incorporated into their mental maps of the landscape. Lily was using this data to argue for more wildlife-friendly infrastructure along the railway. Every documented crossing, every recorded near-miss, added to her case. She said Jacob's reports had been particularly valuable because they included behavioral observations, not just sightings. Understanding how animals interacted with the railway, how they responded to trains and human presence, was crucial for developing effective mitigation strategies. It was slow work, often frustrating, but she believed it was important. Every animal saved, every conflict prevented, contributed to a future where humans and wildlife could better coexist. As autumn progressed, Jacob noticed the bear signs increasing. Tracks in the mud, scat full of berry seeds, claw marks on trees. The bears were preparing for winter, eating voraciously to build up fat reserves. He wondered about the cub and its mother, whether they were among the bears leaving these signs. He liked to think that they were thriving, that the cub had learned to be more careful around human infrastructure. There was no way to know for sure, but the possibility was enough. It connected his present walks to that misty morning, created a continuity that gave deeper meaning to his daily routine. One afternoon, not during his usual morning walk but later when he was returning from town, Jacob saw them, or at least he was almost certain it was them. A mother bear and a yearling cub. The cub now much larger but still clearly subordinate to its mother. They were foraging in a blackberry thicket about 100 yards from the tracks, completely absorbed in their feast. Jacob stopped, watching from a safe distance, his heart racing with recognition and joy. The cub had a particular way of moving, a little hop step when it reached for higher berries. That seemed familiar. It was probably wishful thinking, probably his imagination making connections that weren't there, but he chose to believe. He watched them for nearly an hour, until the shadows grew long and they ambled back into the deeper forest. As they left, the mother bear paused at the tree line, looking back toward the tracks, toward where Jacob stood. For just a moment their eyes met across the distance, and Jacob felt a jolt of connection, of recognition. Then she turned and followed her cub into the forest, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Jacob stood there long after they were gone, feeling grateful for the encounter, for the suggestion that the story he had been part of had a happy continuation. That evening, Jacob told Jessica about seeing the bears. She listened with the same wonder she had shown when he first told her about the rescue, asking questions, wanting every detail. She said it was like a fairy tale, the kind where the hero helps magical creatures and is later rewarded with glimpses of their secret lives. Jacob laughed, said he was no hero, just someone who had been in the right place at the right time. But Jessica disagreed. She said heroism wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about presence, about caring enough to stop and help, about seeing the value in lives different from your own. As winter approached, Jacob's walks became more challenging. Snow and ice made the tracks treacherous, and wildlife sightings became less frequent as many animals reduced their activity or migrated elsewhere. But he persisted, bundled in warm clothes, moving carefully over the slippery rails. The landscape transformed under snow, becoming both more beautiful and more harsh. Tracks were easier to see in the snow, telling stories of nocturnal wanderings, of hunts successful and failed, of the constant struggle for survival that winter represented for wildlife. One snowy morning, Jacob found Michael at their old observation spot, the place where they had watched over the injured fox. He was scattering seed for the birds, a regular practice of his during winter months. They stood together, watching as chickadees and nuthatches descended on the offering, their small bodies puffed against the cold. Michael said he had been thinking about their experiences with the animals, about how they had changed him. He was retiring soon, 42 years on the railway coming to an end, but he planned to stay involved with the wildlife monitoring program that was slowly taking shape. They talked about legacy, about what we leave behind. For Michael, it wasn't just the miles of track he had maintained, or the trains he had kept running safely. It was also these moments of connection with the wild world, the times he had chosen to see the railway as part of an ecosystem rather than separate from it. He hoped the younger workers would carry that perspective forward, would continue to make space for wildlife in their plans and procedures. Change was slow in large organizations, but it did happen. One person, one policy, one moment of compassion at a time. As they stood there in the snow, a train approached, moving slowly due to the weather conditions. They stepped aside to let it pass, and as it did, Jacob saw something that made him smile. In one of the open cargo cars, protected from the wind by the car's high sides, a small bird was riding along, apparently having discovered that trains could be useful for winter travel. It was a tiny thing, probably a finch of some kind, and it seemed completely at ease, preening its feathers as the train carried it to wherever it was going. Another adaptation, another example of wildlife learning to live with human infrastructure. The winter passed slowly, each day shorter than the last until the solstice marked the turning point. Jacob maintained his walks, though sometimes they were brief, just long enough to check the tracks, to maintain his connection with this landscape that had become so important to him. He saw fox tracks regularly, possibly from the pair they had helped, possibly from others. He found pellets from owls, evidence of successful hunts. He watched as ice formed and reformed on the streams that crossed under the tracks, creating temporary sculptures of extraordinary beauty. Spring arrived gradually, then all at once. One day the world was gray and brown, the next it was touched with green. Birdsong increased daily, and Jacob began seeing animals that had been absent or hidden during winter. The bears would be emerging from their dens soon, hungry and looking for early food sources. He wondered about the cub, now probably ready to separate from its mother to begin its independent life. It would face many challenges, many dangers, but it had survived its encounter with the train, had been given a second chance. That had to count for something. On the anniversary of the bear cub rescue, Jacob walked to the spot where it had happened. The coupling where the cub had been trapped looked exactly the same. No sign of the drama that had unfolded there. But Jacob knew the story, carried it with him, let it inform how he moved through the world. He had become, without really intending to, a guardian of sorts for this stretch of track, this borderland between worlds. Not in any official capacity, just someone who paid attention, who was ready to help when help was needed, who saw the value in the wild lives that intersected with human infrastructure. Lily contacted him that spring with exciting news. The first wildlife underpass had been completed, and the camera trap showed animals were already using it. Foxes, raccoons, even a young bear had been recorded passing safely beneath the tracks. It was working, this small concession to wildlife needs, this acknowledgement that the railway existed within a living landscape. She invited Jacob to come see the footage, to celebrate this small victory. When he watched the grainy night vision video of animals confidently using the underpass, he felt a surge of hope. Change was possible. Coexistence was achievable. One underpass, one rescue, one moment of attention at a time. The Community Wildlife Monitoring Group had officially formed, with Jacob reluctantly accepting a coordinator role. They met monthly, sharing sightings, discussing concerns, planning ways to better protect and observe the wildlife along the railway corridor. It was a diverse group, from retired railway workers like Michael to young families like Connor and his grandfather, all united by a shared fascination with the wild lives that persisted at the margins of their town. They organized walks, created educational materials, even started working with the local schools to teach children about wildlife safety and coexistence. One evening, at one of these meetings, a woman named Savannah Reed shared a story. She had been walking the tracks with her daughter when they encountered a deer caught in some old fencing near the railway. Remembering Jacob's stories, they had stayed calm, called for help, and waited with the deer until someone arrived with wire cutters. The deer had been freed unharmed, bounding away into the forest with what Savannah swore was a look of gratitude. Her daughter had talked about nothing else for weeks, had drawn pictures of the deer, had become obsessed with learning about local wildlife. One story had inspired another, creating a ripple effect of awareness and compassion. As summer returned, Jacob noticed changes along the railway corridor. New signs had been posted warning engineers about wildlife crossing areas. The vegetation management had been adjusted to maintain better sight lines while still providing cover for animals. Small things but significant. The railway company, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, was acknowledging its role as a neighbor to wildlife, its responsibility to minimize harm where possible. It would never be perfect, Jacob knew. There would still be conflicts, still be tragedies, but the trajectory was positive, the awareness was growing, and that was something. One morning, walking his familiar route, Jacob encountered a young woman with a notebook and binoculars. She introduced herself as Haley Dawson, a graduate student studying wildlife use of transportation corridors. She had heard about the Community Monitoring Group, about the rescues and observations that had been documented here. She wanted to include this railway corridor in her research, to document how community involvement could influence wildlife management decisions. Jacob spent the morning with her, showing her key locations, sharing stories and observations. It felt good to pass on what he had learned, to see his casual observations becoming part of something larger, more formal. The bears returned that summer, as Jacob had hoped they would. He saw them several times, always at a distance, always with respect for their space. The yearling was nearly as large as its mother now, would soon be on its own. But for now, they were still together, still navigating the landscape as a unit. Each sighting was a gift, a reminder of that misty morning that had changed everything. He never approached them, never tried to recreate that moment of connection. Some things were meant to happen only once, to remain perfect in memory rather than risk disappointment in repetition. Michael's retirement party was held at the railway depot, a gathering of workers past and present, along with members of the wildlife monitoring group. Stories were shared, many involving Michael's quiet acts of kindness toward both humans and animals over his long career. When it was Jacob's turn to speak, he talked about how Michael had been ready that morning with the bear cub, how his preparation and compassion had made the rescue possible. He talked about the sandwiches left out for what Michael thought was an orphaned cub, about the patience and skill that had freed it. Michael, embarrassed by the attention, just smiled and said he had done what anyone would do. But everyone knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have cared enough to help. As the party wound down, Michael pulled Jacob aside. He had something to show him. From his truck, he produced a wooden sign, beautifully carved with the image of a bear and a fox. "Wildlife Crossing," it read. "Proceed with care." He had made it himself, planned to install it at the spot where they had rescued the cub. It wasn't official, might even get removed, but he wanted to mark the place somehow, to remind people that extraordinary things could happen when humans and wildlife intersected with compassion rather than conflict. Jacob helped him install it the next morning, both men working in companionable silence, understanding the significance of the gesture. The sign stood for several months before the railway company noticed it. Jacob expected them to remove it, but instead they replaced it with an official version, nearly identical in design but made of regulation materials. Someone in management, perhaps influenced by the growing awareness of wildlife issues, had decided to let the message stand. It became a landmark of sorts, a reminder to engineers to watch for animals, a symbol of the changing relationship between the railway and the ecosystem it passed through. People began leaving small offerings beneath it, flowers, drawings from children, notes of thanks for animals seen and saved. Autumn came again, and with it the familiar patterns of preparation and migration. Jacob's notebook had grown to several volumes, his observations becoming more detailed, more nuanced. He could predict now where certain animals would appear at certain times, understood the rhythms of the corridor in a way that had only come from patient, sustained attention. He had become, without really meaning to, an expert on this particular intersection of human and wild worlds. People sought him out for advice, for stories, for the wisdom that came from simply paying attention over time. One morning, walking in the early frost, Jacob found tracks that made him stop and stare. Bear tracks, certainly, but two sets, one large and one smaller, but not a mother and cub. Two independent bears walking together, which was unusual outside of mating season. He followed the tracks for a while, curious, until he came upon the bears themselves, foraging in a grove of oak trees. One was definitely the mother from the rescue, recognizable by a distinctive notch in her ear. The other, Jacob realized with a start, was her cub, now fully grown but still maintaining a connection with its mother. They were feeding peacefully, occasionally communicating with soft huffs and grunts. This was remarkable, Jacob knew. Bears typically separated after a year or two, the mother driving off her offspring to make room for new cubs. But here they were, choosing to remain in proximity, perhaps even cooperating in their foraging. It suggested a bond stronger than usual, possibly strengthened by their shared experience with the train. Or perhaps Jacob was anthropomorphizing, seeing meaning where there was only coincidence. But he preferred to believe in the former, in the possibility that trauma shared and overcome could create lasting connections, even among bears. He watched them until they moved on, then continued his walk with a full heart. This was why he came out every morning, why he paid attention. Not for the dramatic rescues, though those were memorable, but for moments like this, quiet revelations about the complex lives of the creatures who shared this landscape. Every walk was a possibility, every observation a small piece of a larger puzzle that would never be completely solved. And that was as it should be. Mystery was part of the magic, the not knowing that kept him coming back, kept him watching, kept him caring. Winter was approaching again, Jacob's second since the bear rescue. He had developed a following of sorts, people who joined him on his walks to learn about wildlife tracking, about reading the stories written in mud and snow. He tried to share not just knowledge, but perspective, the importance of seeing wildlife as neighbors rather than novelties, as individuals with their own needs and desires rather than just representatives of their species. It was a subtle shift in thinking, but an important one. It was the difference between watching and witnessing, between seeing and understanding. One snowy morning, with several others joining him on his walk, they came upon a scene that stopped them all. A fox, probably the same vixen they had helped based on the territory, was teaching her new kits to hunt. They were practicing on each other, pouncing and rolling in the snow, learning the skills that would keep them alive. The vixen watched patiently, occasionally demonstrating a technique, correcting a mistake with a gentle nip. It was a master class in parenting, in the transmission of essential knowledge from one generation to the next. The group watched in silent awe, understanding they were witnessing something precious and private. After the foxes moved on, the group talked quietly about what they had seen. Connor, the young boy Jacob had met months ago, was there with his grandfather. He asked why the mother fox was still teaching her babies when they looked big enough to take care of themselves. His grandfather started to answer, but Jacob interjected gently. He explained that learning to survive was complex, that it took time and practice and patience. Just like Connor was still learning from his grandfather even though he could walk and talk and think for himself. The boy nodded solemnly, understanding the parallel, the universal nature of teaching and learning. As they walked back, Connor's grandfather thanked Jacob again, said these walks had become the highlight of their week. Connor was doing a school project on local wildlife, had interviewed Jacob and Michael and Lily, had become something of an expert himself among his classmates. He wanted to be a wildlife biologist when he grew up, or maybe a train engineer who helped animals. He hadn't decided. Either way, he wanted to be someone who made a difference, who paid attention, who helped when help was needed. The seed, planted by a single story, had grown into a passion that might shape a life. The wildlife underpasses were proving successful beyond anyone's expectations. Lily shared data showing significant decreases in animal train collisions in areas where the underpasses had been installed. The railway company, seeing the economic benefit of fewer delays and equipment damage, had approved funding for more underpasses. It was a win-win situation, the kind that made everyone happy. Jacob attended a presentation where Lily showed video from the underpasses, dozens of species using them regularly, from tiny shrews to full-grown bears. It was proof that small changes could have big impacts, that coexistence was not just possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. Spring came early that year, catching everyone by surprise. The snow melted quickly, revealing a landscape eager to green and bloom. Migration started ahead of schedule, and the railway corridor became busier than ever with wildlife activity. Jacob increased his monitoring, concerned about animals unprepared for the early seasonal change. He found several young animals that seemed disoriented, possibly separated from parents who were following different seasonal cues. Working with Lily and the monitoring group, they were able to reunite most of them, or at least ensure they were safe until they could manage on their own. One particularly memorable morning, Jacob witnessed something he had only read about but never seen. A pair of foxes and a badger were hunting together, the foxes driving prey toward the badger's powerful digging, the badger flushing prey toward the fox's speed. It was a rare example of interspecies cooperation, usually seen only in areas with very specific conditions. That it was happening here, along the railway corridor, suggested that this landscape was healthier than anyone had realized, that the wildlife had developed complex relationships and strategies for survival. He documented it carefully, knowing that Haley would want to include this observation in her research. The bear cub rescue story had become something of a legend in the town, told and retold with various embellishments. Jacob had stopped trying to correct the wilder versions. He understood that stories evolved, that they became what people needed them to be. For some, it was a tale of human heroism. For others, it was about the intelligence and resilience of wildlife. For still others, it was a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when circumstances called for it. All of these interpretations were valid in their way. All of them carried truth, even if they didn't carry facts. On a quiet evening, sitting with Jessica on their porch, Jacob reflected on how much had changed since that misty morning. Not just in his own life, though that transformation had been profound, but in the community's relationship with the wildlife around them. There was more awareness, more respect, more willingness to accommodate the needs of wild neighbors. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was better. And better was good enough, was worth celebrating. Every animal saved, every conflict avoided, every child inspired to care about wildlife, these were victories that added up to something significant. Jessica showed him her latest painting, inspired by his stories but abstract enough to be universal. It showed two worlds overlapping, distinct but connected, neither dominating the other. She called it coexistence, and it perfectly captured what Jacob had been trying to understand and articulate for the past 2 years. That we didn't have to choose between human progress and wildlife conservation, that with attention and intention we could have both. It required compromise, required seeing ourselves as part of nature rather than separate from it, but it was possible. The evidence was all around them. In the successful underpasses, in the thriving wildlife along the corridor, in the community that had formed around a shared commitment to coexistence. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Jacob heard a familiar sound. The call of a fox, somewhere in the distance, answered by another from a different direction. They were communicating across the landscape, maintaining connections despite distance and obstacles. It reminded him that the stories he had been part of were still ongoing, still unfolding in ways he would never fully know. The bear cub was out there somewhere, now fully grown, navigating its world with whatever wisdom it had gained from its early experience with humans. The foxes were raising new generations, teaching them to live alongside railways and roads and human settlements. Life was continuing, adapting, persisting. The next morning, Jacob walked his usual route, but everything felt different. Not the landscape, which was the same as always, but his perception of it. He saw it now as a living story, constantly being written and rewritten by all its inhabitants, human and non-human alike. His role was small but important, to witness, to assist when needed, to share what he learned with others who might also choose to pay attention. The tracks stretched ahead, disappearing into the morning mist just as they had that fateful day 2 years ago. But now Jacob knew that the mist hid not just mystery, but possibility. Not just danger, but opportunity for connection and compassion. As he walked, he thought about Connor and the other young people who had been inspired by these stories. They were the future of wildlife conservation, the ones who would carry forward the lessons learned here. They would face new challenges, climate change and development pressures that would test the fragile balance achieved along this railway corridor. But they would also have tools and knowledge that previous generations lacked, would understand from the beginning that humans and wildlife were part of the same story, not separate chapters. They would know that individual actions mattered, that attention and compassion could change outcomes, that coexistence was not just an ideal but an achievable goal. The sun rose fully, burning off the mist and revealing the landscape in all its complexity and beauty. The railway tracks gleamed in the light, no longer seeming like a scar on the landscape, but like a thread connecting different parts of a larger tapestry. Birds sang from the trees, small mammals rustled in the underbrush, and somewhere, Jacob was certain, bears and foxes were going about their daily lives, navigating the challenges and opportunities of their world. He was privileged to share this space with them, to occasionally glimpse their lives, to sometimes help when help was needed. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything